Hi, leaders. Lapora here. I'm so excited about today's conversation. We're talking about executive presence and emotional intelligence, but I'm especially excited because I had this conversation with a coaching client a couple of weeks ago, and I was specifically sharing this analogy with them. And I said this would be a great story, great conversation to have in one of my vlogs. And so here we are, right? So we're talking about EQ, that emotional intelligence. That is about how you show up, how you respond, how you react. And a lot of times when we think of ideal EQ, we think of a very specific response, right? We think of someone who is calm under pressure and kind and consistently amiable. A lot of times we think of when we think of EQ. However, EQ is about controlling your response. It's not about one particular response. And so when we look at Queen Vashti and we look at Queen Esther, what we see are two very different responses in a very specific singular situation. So we have Queen Vashti, Queen Esther, the same kingdom, the same king, the same patriarchal system, but yet they both each had completely different approaches and responses and completely different ways to manage their executive presence under pressure, if you will. So the Vashti response was a righteous response. It was one where she was going to maintain her dignity and not show off her beauty, for the sake of drunkards, drunk advisors, because that was the king asked. So she wanted to maintain who she was in a very authentic way. And her immediate righteous response was, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that. And it was very important for her to uphold her principles and stand against things that were demeaning and completely beneath who she was as a queen. And you know what? She lost what a lot of people consider to be everything. And we talk about her as if it is a cautionary tale because she's no longer the queen. However, what she did was own her outcome. And that's what we don't hear as much about. Now, on the flip side, we think about Queen Esther, right? And we automatically assume her response was the correct one. And we jump from Queen Vashti to Queen Esther and this response to a king and his desires in that modern day, or in that day, which was modern at the time. So Queen Esther's approach, it was very strategic. And she even, if you recall, had a lot of advisors in her ears as far as how to respond, how not to respond. And she was facing an impossible situation. Her entire people were about to be annihilated, killed. So you talk about pressure. So in fairness, the pressure was significantly higher for her. You would say literally that it was a life and death situation, not just for herself, but for her entire nation. So what does she do? She takes her time, she pauses, she prays, she fasts, and she takes the time to understand what it would take to maintain this relationship. So her relationship was about something that was very important to her. So she controlled her response, but not just one response, but she controlled a series of her responses. And she was very strategic in how she behaved, knowing that all these people were weighing on her shoulders. Queen Esther was being positioned as a historical, influential leader that we can look to in today as someone who kept poise, who kept calm, who put others above herself, and who made decisions that were very different. And a lot of times when we look at Queen Vashti and we look at Queen Esther, we assume the Queen Esthers of the world are more calm and more controlled and making the right decisions. But what I will say, I will give a third wheel sort of perspective of the situation. And what I will say is that these two queens had different stakes and they had different perspectives and they had different ways that they could sacrifice themselves, or the levels that they could sacrifice themselves. And a lot of CHROs today are under toxic cultures. They're under indignation that they know that they are experiencing, trying to have a viable seat at the table. And there are CEOs, and I know there are CEOs listening to this, but I know, quite frankly, there are CEOs who may be undermining the role of the CHRO. Or there may be a CEO who feels like his or her role is undermined by the board of directors. And in that Queen Vashti moment, you want to stand up and say no and draw the line. And that may be the right thing to do. But what you want to ensure is whatever you do, whether you say no and draw the line or you stay steady and hold the course, to make sure that you are owning that outcome and that you're very comfortable with what that outcome may become. So you need to control your response pattern. And that is the key to EQ maturity, emotional intelligence. It's not about necessarily holding back what you have to say, but it's about having control of what you want to say and when you want to say it. And it's not about other people making you have a response or say what they expect you to say, but it's about you saying the right thing in the right moment with the stakes that you know that you are held against, with the sacrifice that you are willing to make. So whether you look at Queen Vashti or Queen Esther as your hero, what you should say is that they both owned their outcomes. Their outcomes were very different from each other, but ultimately they owned those outcomes. And they were able to transform their identities in that context, their positioning, by owning their own outcomes. So from one perspective, Queen Vashti, she made a very huge sacrifice. She made a sacrifice to say her truth and to not lower her dignity. And she was able to hold on to her nobility. And some might even argue be a role model for other women in doing so. And Queen Esther on the other side, she also made sacrifices. She made sacrifices to save a nation. So it's not about the right or the wrong decision, but it's about owning that decision and being strategic about whatever that decision is and knowing that there is going to be an outcome. There are going to be consequences to the decisions that you make, to the way that you show up, the way that you behave, the way that you communicate in the boardroom or otherwise. And while there are those pressures that will challenge you to compromise your vision for the organization or for whatever audience, you have to know that you are owning that outcome of your behavior, of your communication. So there are various stakeholder demands that you're going to have, various conflicts that you're going to find yourself in, market conditions that are going to require decisions, political conditions in this climate that are going to require decisions. And you're going to see a lot of cultural resistance to changes that are going to be absolutely necessary. Sometimes there are going to be cultural resistance to changes that are not absolutely necessary. And you, as a principled leader, are going to have to make that decision of what you're going to stand for and what you're not going to stand for, what steadiness you're going to maintain, what integrity you're going to maintain, what compromises are you going to make for the sake of your teams, for the sake of the marketplace, the society, your organization. These are practical questions that you're going to have to ask yourself. Just like Queen Vashti did and Queen Esther. It may have been a very long time ago, and you may not be a queen standing in front of a king, but what you are is a leader who you're going to have very comparable challenges, I would argue. And you're going to have to make that decision of what EQ looks like for you. What does emotional intelligence look like for you? And I would argue that it looks like you standing still, contemplating what the impact of your decisions will be, your behavior, your communication, and then making that decision that you can be comfortable with, owning those outcomes that follow subsequently beyond that. Hopefully that you have benefited somehow to this vlog. If you have, or if you think someone else might benefit, please share it with someone. If you've enjoyed it or benefited from it, click the like button, and would love to hear your comments. Would love to hear your perspective below. Share your perspective on how you build coalitions within your organizations, within your teams, and or how you stand up in a way that honors the outcomes that you would like to see, that you would expect. Because whatever the situation that you're in, know that your influence should be one that is strategic and that is going to have an impact on those who you lead. Have a great day.